we started marketing for this event, the response has been overwhelming. It seems like we've hit a nerve. I think the reason why we've had so many people interested in this topic is that most of you want to know, why is it that in 2014 we still have problems with electricity in most African countries? According to the International Energy Agency, Sub-Saharan Africa will require more than $300 billion in investment to achieve universal electricity access by 2030. More than $300 billion. Where will this money come from? Most of you in the room want to know what is stopping African countries from providing reliable energy to individuals, schools, hospitals, businesses, and manufacturing activities. Is renewable energy a solution? We have a lot of sun and wind. With so much natural gas and hydropower potential, why are there still major blackouts in Nigeria, in DRC, or in Ethiopia? Well, our distinguished panelists will answer these questions and much, much more. But first, let me introduce a very special moderator, Mr. Kamran Khan. You have his bio in the brochure. He is the Vice President of Department of Compact Operations at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Let me also mention that he's been working on Power Africa since it's launched by President Obama. This is a $7 billion project to increase energy access in 6 African countries: Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, Ghana, Liberia, and Ethiopia. Let's give a very warm welcome to Kamran Khan.
Thank you. I'm just going to start from here. Okay. Thank you very much. So, can everybody hear me in the back? It's working? Great. So my name is Kamran Khan, and I have the honor of being the moderator today. So first of all, on behalf of the panel who will come here in a minute and all the audience, I just want to thank Amini and AI for organizing this very interesting discussion here in New York. We have had a few of these in Washington, D.C., but this, I believe, is the first one in New York, and I'm looking forward to being a part of that. Electrification of Africa used to be at one point a moral issue of regional significance. It is now very much a global issue with very, very strong economic implications as the levers of global growth start to shift more and more towards Africa, and the world starts to look for the next driver for global economic growth. Africa is becoming a key point of interest, and when we look at growth in Africa, as Amini said, the dismal, very, very low levels of electrification cannot be avoided. You have to look at them and say this has got to be one of the key constraints to growth. The current situation, and the numbers change, but roughly speaking, the current situation is that Africa requires about $40 billion worth of investment a year to meet the demand for the current demand for electricity. And I say current, meaning this is what we know now. And as you know, when economies evolve, their demand for electricity goes up substantially. And currently, Africa gets about 1/3 of what it needs. And that 1/3 is, by and large, either coming from the public budgets or coming from the donors. So very, very little of that investment in the power sector is actually coming from the private sector. And we know from experiences around the world that private investment has to be the key driver for electrification in Africa. Otherwise, really, there is no chance. Even the richest of the richest countries are trying to get private capital in the power sector. So it will be absolutely impossible to imagine a world in which Africa is able to get to even reasonable levels of electrification without significantly increasing private investment. Last year, President Obama launched the Power Africa initiative. As Vinny said, it currently covers 6 countries. The U.S. commitment is somewhere in the neighborhood of $7 billion. And there are various different U.S. government agencies that are leading the U.S. government initiative. And they include, obviously, USAID, OPEC, XM, Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, USCDA, and USADF. That's the African Development Organization. And we have African Development Foundation, and we have Michelle here representing ADF. So we will have a very good discussion today with government agencies. We have representatives from some of these countries. We have not-for-profit. We have a very diverse panel that will allow us to really hopefully get to the bottom of what is happening in Africa, why this issue exists, and what are the chances that we will be able to resolve some of these problems in the coming years. Let me just introduce the panel very quickly, and then I'll ask all of them to come up here. First, we have Michelle Rivard, who's the Chief of Staff for the U.S. Africa Development Foundation, USADF. There's Michelle. We have Agnes Vassevich, Director for Private Capital Group for Africa with the U.S. Agency for International Development. I should tell you, just by way of disclosure, that many years ago I used to work at USAID, so if you see me being very nice to Agnes, you'll know why. We have Mr. Paul Mawafongo, Minister Plenipotentiary, Economics Affairs, Embassy of Tanzania. Paul has to leave because of an emergency, so he will not be able to stay through the whole discussion. Possibly we will try to get his comments as quickly as we can. And then last but not least, we also have Honorable George Ngwenya. Did I say it right, sir?
Close.
You will correct me. You will correct me, no doubt, and I will try to learn. He's the Consul General for South Africa in New York. And then Tony Vandermeulen. He is a Global Strategy Operations Executive and also involved in Shift into Green Energy, ECUA, which is a green energy group very active in emerging economies. So may I ask the panel to come up to the stage, and then we'll start the discussion. Okay, let me first set the format for the discussion today. I will first ask all the panelists to make 3-minute open remarks on anything that they wish to discuss. They can talk about their organizations. They can make key points that they want to make about electrification in Africa or Power Africa initiative. Whatever, it's open time, 3 minutes for each of them. This will be followed by a panel discussion. I have a few suggested areas in which I will start to ask them questions, and hopefully we'll get a discussion going in the panel. And at any point, once the discussion starts, if you have questions, just raise your hand. I would rather not wait till the end of the discussion to involve the audience. It'll be nice to have you involved throughout the process. So just raise your hand if I'm not coming to you. It's not because I didn't see you. It's probably because I just want a particular thought to conclude through the panel. Okay, so I am going to start first with Paul because I know he has to leave. So 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. I don't know. Anybody can hear me? Probably. Okay, my name is Paul Mofongo. Don't care about the diplomatic titles. I'm Minister Plenipotentiary, but just call me Paul. The organizers of this forum this evening. It's important for us. The energy sector is very important to us. As you remember, President Obama was in Tanzania. He visited Tanzania as one of the countries in Africa. And we value the partnership which we have between Tanzania and the US. And we believe the Power Africa initiative is going to be a challenge we're having right now. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we just keep going in line? Tony?
Yes. I'm Tony Tondemule. I am the Director of Global Strategic Relations for a new company Shift into Green Energy ECUA. We are an energy saving, energy management firm that does energy efficiency as well as solar development. My background is having come through a full circuit of development agencies. I worked for the United Nations for a while, for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. I worked for the American government for many years as well, developing American companies to plug them into export opportunities. And I also worked in Africa, in Kinshasa, with an export-import company. So that's somewhat of my background. The work that we do is to bring together a consortium of foreign companies with different interests to develop projects in developing markets. We're focusing right now in Ecuador, and we have a project now that we're discussing with government officials in Ghana. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Michelle Rivard with the U.S. African Development Foundation, which, regardless of the name, is a small government agency that is funded by taxpayers like you and us. We are focused on economic development at the grassroots level. We directly fund African organizations and cooperatives and small businesses to help them build capacity as well as to grow and expand their businesses. And so you might say, so Power Africa, what's the connection here? So let me just draw a few examples. Imagine you're in northern Kenya, you're a pastoralist in the arid lands, and you want to maintain your way of life. Well, it'd be really nice to have water and a place to charge your cell phone. One of the Power Africa Offgrid energy grants in partnership with General Electric Africa that ADF has recently made as part of this government initiative that you'll be learning more about includes a solar-powered solution for boreholes that will include a place where hundreds of pastoralists can not only bring their livestock to get much needed water, but they can also plug in their cell phone. Another example also in Kenya, while ADF mostly works in rural areas and has a very large percentage of agricultural projects in our portfolio, again, responding to the need of the Africans and communities of what they are asking for, what problems they are seeking to solve with a little bit of help from some funding and technical assistance. Well, here's a different look at it. In the slums in Nairobi, there are all sorts of challenges. One group that we are funding is looking at biomass, and they have a number of biodigesters that they are using in the city, and they are generating power that small, micro businesses, not even small, are going to be using, so they can better control their own livelihoods, destinies, and so on. Moving across the continent to Nigeria, we all hear about post-harvest loss, roads, warehouses, marketing and distribution systems. Well, in Jos, in northern Nigeria, we are funding another project with a small company that's not building a big refrigerated warehouse. but instead they're recognizing the need of the farmers. And these are not the farmers who have a ranch, you know, as big as the size of Rhode Island. Rather, they're people who maybe have a hectare or a couple, but they are growing fragile fruits and vegetables, and they need to get them to market. And with this grant that we have recently funded, it is a very small refrigerated warehousing might be a really big word to use, but small units that smallholder farmers can rent by the hour, by the day, to put in their fragile produce and help them reduce this post-harvest loss. So it is a right-sized solution to one of the energy needs that we see with the populations we serve on the continent.
Hello, my name is Agnes Vassevich, and I am the head of Private Capital Group for Africa within USAID. I just wanted to point out it's very significant that my group, which has private capital in its name, is actually an integral and a major part of Power Africa Initiative. As a matter of fact, I'm currently serving as the Deputy Coordinator for Power Africa Initiative. And that is because Power Africa is very much about partnership with the private sector. The private sector was integral in formulating the strategy for Power Africa by allowing us to get access to information on what kind of policy reforms would accelerate investment in energy in key African countries. And what's even more important is that private sector is not just private sector companies from the US or from Europe. More than 50% of all the companies that have committed to support Power Africa are African companies. I think that is probably incredibly rare when it comes to initiatives that the US government has initiated. But it's incredibly significant and hopefully really bodes well for the future. So once again, private capital is integral to meeting the needs of energy in Africa. Not only should that private capital be coming from the US, Europe, Asia, but really it could come from Africa itself. And I really look forward to telling you more about how Africans are continuing to develop projects and invest to really bring energy to the continent.
Mr. Consul General, I don't want to butcher your name again, so I'll wait till you pronounce it, and then I'll use it.
Okay, thank you. And my name is George Munyimai, and I'm the Consul General for South Africa. Let me just start by thanking the organizers of this conference this evening. I think it comes at a very opportune time, given the fact that Africa is pretty much on the cusp of really joining the rest of the world in terms of economic development. And I think this is quite significant because it is happening at a time when a lot of focus, is beginning to fall more and more on the African continent, given the fact that the economic growth has been quite substantive, particularly over the past 5 years or so. Now, in order to sustain the types of economic development that we want to see and the upliftment of lives on the African continent, you surely need energy investment to a large extent to make sure that we can continue to drive the type of investments that we want to see going into the African continent. Now, this has been to a large extent quite an impediment for growth, given the fact that if you just look at the figures when it comes to electrification of the African continent in comparison to the rest of the world, they don't really look good at this stage. And we know that as Africa, we're not attracting the right amount of investments, to actually try and meet the type of growth or the type of demand that we want to see, particularly if we're to double, the amount of people who are receiving electricity within the African continent. And just to throw maybe a couple of figures, I think with the exception of South Africa, for instance, the entire size of electricity that goes onto the African continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is about 29,000 gigabytes, which is quite small. But that's the size of Argentina, if you were to think about it from that perspective. If you were to look at you know, the inflows of investments going into energy. You know, I think over the past few years we've received about roughly $600 million into energy projects on the African continent. But in fact, we need about over $20 billion per annum going forward. Now, this should be coming from not only domestic investments, but it should be coming from the private sector and from other investments everywhere else. Maybe I will just conclude by saying that you know, we know that the continent is quite well endowed in terms of the abundance of you know, fossil fuels and you know, and renewable resources for generating energy. I think the trick really lies into how do we actually invest into really turning these resources to generate the type of energy that we require. And in that sense, the Power Africa initiative has really come at an opportune moment, I believe, for the continent. And you know, our efforts are underway to unlock this potential. Secondly, I think it also comes at a time when we should be focusing really on the entire on the entire electricity supply value chain, both on the generation, the transmission, and distribution. And I think a good example would be the partnership, you know, coming from South Africa between a U.S. company called Luke and Eskom, who have actually partnered, you know, to actually try and expand, you know, the type of energy projects, you know, that span the three areas that I've mentioned, you know, not only in Southern Africa, but throughout the entire continent. And hopefully, during the discussions, we'll talk about some of the projects.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Bunyamani. Somewhat. I am also, apart from being a moderator, I'm also representing the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So let me quickly tell you what MCC is and what we're doing in Power Africa, and then I don't have to talk about MCC after that. MCC is also a U.S. government agency that does international development. It's a small agency. It is very, very focused and very selective in the way it picks its partners. So we have a framework of 20 different indicators that are managed by other organizations like Transparency International or World Bank or UNDP. And a country has to qualify, be above the median within their peers in those indicators for them to qualify for MCC funding. Out of the 6 countries that are part of Power Africa, 3 are MCC countries, and 2 of them are countries where we have actually done projects in the past. So MCC does very few, you know, works in very few countries, but where it works, it spends quite a bit of money and gives only block grants. It has a very, very unique model in terms of working through the local organizations. We set up an actual SPV with a board and a CEO, and that becomes our counterpart. And the amount of investment we put in usually quite significant. So in Tanzania, we have a compact. We call these compacts when we sign them. We have a compact which is about $500 million. In Ghana, we finished one which was again more than $500 million. And we are currently preparing new compacts both in Ghana and Tanzania and Liberia. Liberia would be the first one, but Ghana and Tanzania would be second compacts. We have quite a bit of experience in actually building large infrastructure projects. So some of the projects that you may have heard of probably didn't know they were financed by MCC. Let me just give you a sense. The George Bush Highway in Accra was financed by us. The Benin Port was financed by MCC. The fiber optic cable, which basically brings all the electricity to Zanzibar in Tanzania, was financed by MCC. So we've done a lot of these very, very difficult long-term construction projects. We have very good in-house technical capabilities, and we're very selective. So we will be engaged in these 3 countries, definitely in the power sector, and we have a commitment under Power Africa to invest in these 3 countries over the next 3 to 5 years. So with that, I conclude my corporate responsibility, and I can now move on to the moderator responsibility. So I'm going to start off with the first question for my friend Agnes, partially because USAID truly is coordinating the Power Africa initiative from many different angles. Agnes, the foreign direct investment in Africa, I remember in the 1990s, used to be literally barely above $1 billion. And I believe it's somewhere around 40 something right now. So, you know, in little over a decade, FDI has shot up significantly, and it is very much in line with our perception of Africa rising. But very little of that is coming into infrastructure, and perhaps less still in the power sector. Why?
Thank you. I'll start by saying that, first of all, it's good news that FDI in Africa is increasing. I think that that's a trend that we need to support. I've also noted that a lot of investors are very interested in Africa. They hear about the 6 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. They hear about African capitalists starting up funds and large enterprises, and they're very interested. However, at the same time, I think there are 2 issues. One is that there is a perception of very high risk, and this is mainly political risk, which partly is probably unjustified, and I think that, especially in some countries that are growing very fast and do provide good investment destinations. And I think Africa needs a little bit better marketing, especially in places like the US, to really compete with the other emerging markets who are presenting themselves as investment destinations. I think that's changing, but I think that more of that is needed. I think the other reason is, unfortunately, in some of the countries, including in the countries where we're working, I think that there's been a lot of progress made on regulatory reform. But sectors like energy are still very slow in changing and opening up to private investment. I think I could mention Ethiopia, which actually took a huge step very recently by inviting the first private investor to enter its energy sector and develop a 500 to 1,000 megawatt geothermal plant. This will be the first private investment in the energy sector in Ethiopia. So I really think that changing regulations, opening up markets in a very cautious but deliberate way, especially for investment in the energy sector where so much money is needed. It's more money than I think donors and governments can really muster up. And catalyzing private sector investment is really key. So I think much better marketing and progress on a lot of regulations, and I will add a third one. I know I'm taking a lot. The other one is, and I think most governments recognize this, is just capacity building, meaning that I think that we really need to help a lot of the African regulators become more familiar with how to deal with the private sector, how to really react to investor proposals, so that not only can they in the future do this on their own without additional assistance, but also so that they get equitable deals from these investors that might be coming into these countries. So USAID is very much involved in not only helping change the regulatory regimes and investment environments, but also building the capacity of the governments to maintain this kind of progress and to really gain and maintain the kind of skills that are needed to sustain that.
Okay, so let's take it to a potential recipient country. So Paul, in Tanzania, what does Power Africa mean to you? How, from a country that is part of this initiative, how do you prepare as a country for investment? And what do you expect from the U.S. government agencies to do for you? I'm also interested to hear your perspective on private investment. To what extent do you think you have control over this? How does the government think about private investment? Do you proactively go out and try to market, as Agnes was saying, or do you think that those marketing strategies don't really work very well?
Thank you. let me come back to one major point that Tanzania has made quite major reforms in so many sectors, including the energy sector. As you know, Mr. Khan, in Tanzania we had one company which has been a monopoly in the energy sector. It has been doing everything actually, generation, transmission, and in terms of, in the whole context, everything. But in 1992, the government decided to introduce private sector. We have also a new law since 1992 trying to encourage the private sector in the energy sector. But the challenge again is in the current company, which is TANESCO. Its monopoly is so big, and we need to unbundle all the activities. So that's one of the challenges. How do you unbundle that? But again, we have the challenge of reforming the tariffs. And you don't know how you're going to reform that, because the way we have been operating in Tanzania, that the government has 100% ownership of that company. And once you reform the tariffs, the electricity tariffs are going to be so high. So we have to do that very carefully. One more point, I wanted to go back to the Power Africa initiative. We have received the Power Africa initiative very positively in Tanzania, but there are a number of areas which I think we need to look into together in partnership. As one of colleagues said, the fear the Americans are having, even most of the private donors who are giving funding to these big projects in Africa, is the fear they are having about Africa, the risk which they think without minimizing those risks, nothing is going to happen in Africa. I think it's time now for the Americans to change the thinking and the mindset. Why? Because Africa is a different continent. We are reforming. There are so many things that we are doing in Africa, and we think we have to work together in supporting Africa in reforming even the legal system and so many areas in that context. And I think the opportunity for America and the other companies are there to help reform all those areas. And the challenge we are having, because we have so many other partners we are working with, like the Chinese. The approach taken by the Chinese is completely different from what the Americans are taking. Actually, in our own thinking in Tanzania, we think Power Africa is a solution, but again, we have a challenge. We don't know how we're going to access all these funds. These funds from different sources have different terms and conditions. And we think some of the instruments are not suitable for Africa. Leave alone the MCC. MCC has done a lot in Tanzania, and we think we can go along with the MCC. And we are happy that we are now a beneficiary of MCC2, which is under negotiation at the moment. MCC have done a lot in Tanzania, and we are almost, let me say that, at quite a better level than other donors in that area. So I think it's better to also have new instruments for Africa, so that we know exactly how much we're going to access in terms of funding. But again, since most of the countries in Africa, like Tanzania, we have to plan. You have to predict how much resources you're going to get for certain projects. we have opportunities, but we don't know how much you're going to get from the different sources. So those are some of the challenges. I think we can discuss more issues in that area.
Sure. I think one of the process that takes place in any development program is that as Agnes was saying, as the donors come in and they're building capacity, we're also at the same time building capacity in the donor agency to learn to work in that country. And certainly at MCC, we have learned and we continue to learn, and we have a lot more to learn. And I'm just wondering to what extent that is also true for the private sector. So Tony, I know we will come to you with some questions and get your comments on technology and other issues, but I know that from your background, you have also been quite actively involved in advising private firms as they enter emerging economies. To what extent do you think private companies also have a bit of education to go through to understand how to do business in these countries? I mean, I say this with some reservation. You know, they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder and risk is in the eye of the investor. So for others to question where risk is too much or too little is usually not a very smart thing. But with that caveat, do you think that the private companies need to sort of get a better understanding of Africa before they can take advantage of the opportunities there?
I definitely do think that American companies need to obtain more comprehensive information on Africa across the board, social information, demographic information. I having worked with American companies extensively, I find that, especially with regards to Africa, to be an incredible impediment. The larger companies have a wherewithal and a deep pockets to be able to take care of that problem. They can establish subsidiaries overseas. They can hire attorneys overseas in the major capitals, and they can have an inside view of the landscape, of the economic landscape in any particular market that they're developing. I think we have a way to go here in the United States as far as getting a different mindset and looking at Africa in a much more realistic way.
So, Michelle, in your the way you all give very grassroots grants for organizations to actually fix things and some of the projects you mentioned, how are you focused on actually getting companies ready to do business? To the point where whether it's, you know, it doesn't need to be joint ventures with GEs of the world, but actually doing business either regionally within the country. Is that part of the focus?
Yes, it very much is. And really the off-grid energy work that we're doing as part of Power Africa is in some sense a departure, because we recognize that while in our core work, we work with some very small groups, some groups who maybe have 50 to 100 members, and they may not really even understand whether or not they're making a profit because they're not keeping their books. We work with some much more sophisticated cooperatives who are already exporting X number of containers of high-end coffee to, you know, Europe and selling it to Starbucks in the United States. But when it comes to the power needs that we have been moving up the learning curve very rapidly over the last year to try to get our arms around and to try to help catalyze with some pilots, we're going to small companies. Now, they are all African-led. They are 100% African-owned and managed. Some of them have a very good track record, and they came to ADF. They were, you know, one of 6 companies of over 150 who applied in the first round of our grant challenge, and they maybe are just expanding. So we have some Kenyan companies who have a model that is really looking at innovative ways of not only distributing, but as well, what kind of metering systems are they putting into place? what kind of warranties and guarantees are they providing to their customer base so the solar lanterns they're plugging, you know, don't break down in a year and then everyone is left high and dry. So we are really looking again at a different level of an African small business that has the basic small business, you know-how and building blocks in terms of accounting, in terms of management, in terms of basic finances, in terms of marketing, in terms of putting a business plan together. And so we see that level of know-how there. What we don't see is patient capital, even at this very small level. We don't see a lot of project finance. So we really want to be helping these small, innovative African companies who are already in the energy sector, or they may be using this ABC model of an anchor tenant, businesses around it who need access to reliable, affordable electricity, as well as a wider customer base, such as a university we're working with in the western part of Nigeria that has taken some technology that's hydroelectric as well as solar to not only be solving their own energy needs, but also be serving the wider community.
So speaking of patient capital, George Manyamani, I just came from South Africa this morning, and I met with the South African Treasury and Ministry of Energy, and I was just amazed at how successful the renewable IPP program of South Africa is. You know, Eskom being on one side, but on the renewables, they are doing unbelievable amount of business, and they are oversubscribed. They've brought the asking price down significantly. So the question to you is, how can South Africa help some of the regional players? I mean, obviously you buy electricity from Lesotho and some of the other countries, but in terms of know-how and knowledge, how is there a chance that South Africa might be able to help? And what can these countries do to learn from South Africa on their own? Oh, and what can, you know, U.S. government agencies and other donors do to create that bridge?
Thank you. I think firstly, let me just say that it is important to note the fact that the challenges that we face when it comes to energy, you know, are actually quite regional. You know, so therefore, it requires a regional approach. You know, it is an issue that requires cross-border initiatives. You know, if you're going to really address the issue of electricity, both from a generation and transmission and distribution perspective. So that is quite important. What role can we play as South Africa? We believe that we have played quite an important role there within the region and beyond. Firstly, as an investor and through one of our public utilities that I mentioned earlier, which is Eskom. And I think that is quite important because as soon as you begin to actually accumulate and harvest the resources within the region, that will actually assist you to unlock, you know, some of the potential that we want to see, even from an economic, growth perspective. So that's quite critical. I had mentioned just the example that is related to the Power Africa initiative, which is, pretty much a partnership between Eskom and Duke Energy, which is a U.S. company, you know, to try and drive some of the initiatives within that region. And we believe that that in itself not only attracts investments, but it also brings in technology. You know, the issue of technology transfer becomes a very important one to look at. We as a government, of course, in South Africa, are pursuing initiatives to ensure that we can at least double the percentage share of renewable energy within the energy mix as a whole. We have also gone through a scenario where we faced our own challenges. As you know, a few years back, you know, we really had an energy crunch within South Africa, which was a very good time to learn because we had also gone for about a decade without investing, you know, in the generation of new energy. So we were moving from, really moving from that perspective. So I think there's a lot to do, and there's a lot that we can achieve within the region and beyond in working for the countries.
Speaking of, by the way, any questions? Yes, please.
Can I just...
Just go ahead and ask, and I'll
All right.
repeat it for you.
Hi, my name is Neha Misra. I serve as a Chief Collaboration Officer of a startup social enterprise called Solar Sister. We are working in Uganda, Tanzania, Nigeria, and we are at the cusp of scale-up. We are working with the Development Innovation Ventures and the W Power program from the State Department. My question is related to our work, which is focused on one last mile distribution of clean energy for over 600 million Africans who have not seen a single light bulb. So which is other part of the picture, right? One, we are talking about large scale infrastructure level projects, but two, then hand in hand, there's a big need to develop, like Michelle, you were talking about off-grid projects and really grassroots efforts. So under Powering Africa scheme of things, how much focus is there to really take these successful models which are there from cute little programs which are great, but you know, if you look at the scale of the people who do not have the most basic access, how do we address that? And piggyback on that, what is central to the sister part of Solar Sister, that 70% of those without access to electricity in Africa are women and girls. You know, so how do we make sure, you know, that the efforts that we are taking are really in a gender inclusive manner across that human supply chain, that you know, whether it's manufacturing or even maintenance service line, be it at large scale or at off-grid levels. If you have any insights from the work you were doing.
It's a great question. So, question for, yes, from two angles. By the way, did people in the back hear the question? Do I need to repeat it? Yes? Okay. So the question came from Solar Sister. And the question is about off-grid, microgrid type of technologies, different projects that are happening. How do you scale them up? How do you deal with social and other regional equity issues? And then related to that is the technology discussion, which I would like to bring certainly Tony into. You know, one is, Michelle, you are working quite a bit on these microgrid. I know AID is also starting to look at some of these microgrid things. What are the possibilities of scaling this stuff up? Because we often come up with very nice, as you said, cute quote-unquote models or cute projects, but which don't get scaled up. So do we, and to meet this challenge, we really need to find ways to scale these things up. But before that, we get into that, Tony, technology. Does Africa have any chance of leapfrogging? Are there more affordable technologies that are now becoming a little bit more easy to use that, you know, may have been difficult when Asia was going through this process, or maybe Latin America and other regions?
Yes, they are, and the African development agencies know that, and they are looking for cleaner.
Can you bring the mic closer to you, or just come closer to the mic?
Yes, technology can scale up, especially vis-a-vis renewable energy. The African Development Bank, for example, has one of its priorities in its medium-term objectives to promote technology in the renewable energy field. Now, how are they going to do that? They have looked at the problem from a microeconomic level, from a firm level. You know, how do you start building from the firm up? And the number of policies that the African Development Bank has proposed, as well as other development agencies.
Tony, they still can hear in the back. Sorry.
So the proposals that have been put forth in order to be able to scale up technology in a much more widespread and sustainable manner involve, for example, regulatory reform and policy reform. That is something which the development agencies are very much focusing on. And again, that's on the local, regional level. Another way that the development agencies are helping regional countries scale up technology and apply it is by encouraging and leveraging different financing options that can be brought into the continent in order to be able to fund renewable energy products that are produced through the use of renewable energy. So financing is another significant issue. But the interesting thing is that they already know that. You know, the African Development Bank already knows what it has to do in order to be able to develop and scale up its technology. And I find that very, very holistic, well-rounded approach to looking at the problem and trying to find a solution. The problem, of course, is getting energy. Getting energy to households that don't have any electricity. But what regional member countries want to do, along with development agencies, is to be able to do that in a sustainable, efficient, cleaner manner. And that is a primary goal across Africa. So I think that not only in this respect, but in many, many other respects, we really need to look at the micro level. What can be done already at the micro level that can save money and redirect resources to better use and affect the bottom line? New private capital is good, but I think in order to be able to get a baseline, you need to know where you're working from. And there are those kinds of analysis I think that we need to do in many different areas before we start talking about using private capital.
Okay, so Michelle, we donor agencies, my agency, my current and former agencies all included, we have often known what needs to be done but failed to do it. And we've really, at MCC, we've come to a point where we say, in order for something to be really sustainable, it has to involve private capital. That's the only way you can actually be sure that this is something that will get replicated. What can be done, at least as a U.S. government commitment under Power Africa, to try to really, not do cute projects that go nowhere after one or two things, but only do things that are scalable, and we kind of, at least from day one, have a good sense that it will be scalable. What can be done? And then I know there are two questions, well, more than two questions. Fantastic. So we'll come. Well, why don't we do the questions so that maybe they can address some of these questions when they reply. I think you were early on, and then you, sir.
My name is Ezequiel Escofera. I'm a founder and CEO of DuSAR. My background is Ethiopia. So I started this project with company about a year and a half ago. We focused mainly on efficiency, reliability, and quality, because that's one of the main things that we realized that was lacking in Africa. People are breaking down a couple of months, and people invest a lot of the money that they don't have. The products they have, mainly on the solar and equipment. To that end, we have been able to increase our energy storage efficiency up to 95%, and also the life of that energy storage up to 10 years. But we've come to a point where we want to get this product out and test it in the market. My question is, how do we do that? And is there an understanding of, in this Power Africa initiative, like lifetime cost, instead of just products that cost $30, $40, versus looking at 10 years, 20, 25. Are there special initiatives on that? And also, on the private sector, there are some grants that we work with. Our product has been written by the State Department and USAID did, but we'd like to get as the division of resources, I would say, scale it out. So if there are these initiatives or awareness.
Okay, great. Thank you. There are a whole bunch of, okay, yes, you were next.
My name is Leroy Wilson Jr. I'm an attorney, and my focus is on commercial relationships involving issues have some connection with the national country. My question is directed to Agnes. In your statement, you said that one of the things that the country would have to do is to work on reforming certain regulatory schemes. What I'd like you to address is what Paul said, and that is Paul said that in trying to break up the monopoly of the electric company in Tanzania, they're going to run into some very serious tariff problems. So what advice would you give them in terms of how to make them tariff?
Okay. Yes, sir.
My name is Winfred Omakwe, and I come from Ghana. I work as a media planner. I have this, well, there's a myth out there that most foreign aid that goes to Africa is supposed to be used and not necessarily beneficial to Africans. So I want to know to what extent would Obama's funding source to Africa be beneficial to help grassroots companies in Africa to be mainstream such that the economy of Africa can grow. And also my second question is, most businesses or all businesses will have to work in companies that, or work at places where they can be secure to invest and also they can make profit. As ambassador from Tanzania was saying that if private companies come into Africa to invest, prices of electricity might shoot up. So to what extent would companies find investments in Africa profitable enough such that they'll be willing to take the risk in order to go into Africa, and Africans will also be willing to support in order to make this whole development sustainable and beneficial to Africa?
Okay. There's a question here. Yes.
I'm Kofi Boateng, former CEO of the Africa America Institute, and now Executive Director of West Harlem Development Corporation.
Welcome. You've set up a very nice organization, which is...
Well, and Amini is doing a fantastic job.
Yes, she is.
Yes. Okay. In your introduction, you said that Africa needs about $400 billion of investment a year. Okay, and you multiply it out, and it's in the trillions. So if Power Africa is 7 billion, what are we really talking about? Now, related to the question that Sister Sola asked, wouldn't the funds for Power Africa be more useful in reaching the people, as in this literature here, the 690 million Africans who are actually in darkness, knowing that $7 billion needed for $400 billion investment isn't going to do anything, and yet if we're focused on bringing power, all great power, to those who really need it, for kids to study with a lantern, with one light bulb. Some of us studied with candles before we could come and head the African American Institute. So imagine what more we could have done if we had a light bulb, one light bulb. Okay, so I would think that we're talking about Africa. Amini started in her introduction saying that the sun is plentiful. We all know that, especially in this weather. And the solar conversation seems to be completely missing. What are the successful examples somewhere outside Africa that we could learn from?
Okay, great. One last question, and then we'll go to the panelists. Sorry, I got to go that way. I'll come back to you.
Hi, Jake Bright, Bloomberg and the Foreign Policy Association. Hopefully I didn't miss this in the beginning, so I was a little late, and it could be for Agnes or whoever is most qualified. But I'm wondering if somebody could comment on, within the U.S. government, who is responsible or most responsible for coordinating Power Africa, the metrics, the capital, and ultimately answering to what it's supposed to accomplish and what it does accomplish. Because I mean, it's not unusual, but there's so many different points of communication that are connecting to it.
Okay, very good. Can we go back to the scale up, and then we'll try to go through these questions one by one.
Sure. So let me address what you had asked and the gentleman from Ghana as well. ADF doesn't want to be in the grant-making business for off-grid energy. We do because we want to be testing business models. We have a small amount of resources. We are testing pilots. And we believe that there are all sorts of technologies out there in solar, in wind, in hydro, and biogas that can be right-sized for Africans. Because there are plenty of engineers and other entrepreneurs all across the globe, in particular in Africa, who are ingenious. What we care about is how can these be profitable? Not sustainable, but profitable. So we are trying to, again, help catalyze these small businesses who have an idea or are already doing something on a smaller scale to say, do you have, again, one of my favorite terms, your business, your basic business blocks in place? Have you done your market research? So you're providing to 1,000 customers now. If you provide to 5,000, do the numbers work? So we really are pushing in terms of how we have designed our request for proposals, how we are looking at applications, not simply, is this nifty, does this sound really cool, is this a really good photo op, but rather looking behind the screen at the accounting, at the managers, at the testing. Is this going to be making money so it actually can grow? So that is our small piece of it. And I would like to turn over to Agnes to talk further about the wider Beyond the Grid initiative that this government-wide, presidentially led initiative is pursuing. And in fact, because of the very reasons that many of you have asked, there are millions of people who are beyond the grid that no matter how much, this year and next year, private actors invest in Tanzania and other places, their needs are not going to be met today or tomorrow.
I think these are all amazing questions. And to tell you the truth, I don't even know where to start. But a couple of comments.
Start with the easy ones.
All of them actually were quite good, and I've answered well. Let me just say that when you look at the Power Africa countries, you really see countries with very different needs because they're in very different stages. So something that is appropriate in Liberia, which has the same amount of energy as is used by Cowboy Stadium, to a place like Tanzania that's actually made huge progress towards providing energy, or to a place like Nigeria, which just completely privatized its entire energy sector. There are huge differences. So I think solutions that apply to one are better in one country than another, which is why Power Africa is a whole of government initiative. So it's not just about MCC supporting large projects. It's also about the African Development Foundation supporting smaller off-grid projects. Having said that, I think there were a lot of questions about how are we supporting these smaller businesses already. So as an example, I want to use a company called Juventus, which maybe my Ethiopian colleague is familiar with. It's actually a company that was started by an Ethiopian American out of Michigan. He started this company in Michigan, and then he moved to Ethiopia. This company makes energy meters. Basically, it's been developed, he's developed this company, and they're now manufacturing the meters in Ethiopia. It started out very small, and what it did is it had a very difficult time going from the grant stage to more of a sustainable financing stage. So the first thing that we did as Power Africa is USAID has a guarantee program where we guarantee loans that banks make to such businesses. So we gave him what we call a portable guarantee so that he can go to local banks and say, if you lend me this money, USAID will guarantee 50%. That allowed him to get some local financing. The second thing that happened is Power Africa connected him with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and USTDA, which run a program out of South Africa, which gives funds for feasibility studies and business development for smaller businesses in energy, in clean, actually, renewable energy. And because efficiency falls into that, he applied and received then a grant for further development of the business from this facility. That grant then led to the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is the investment arm of the U.S. government, looking at potentially giving him more finance at larger scale, which is now being considered. So this kind of shows how potentially Power Africa, because of the involvement of all these agencies, and actually this, I think this also answers the question the gentleman posed about who's really responsible. We actually have weekly meetings where all the agencies report on progress in Power Africa, and this progress is really reported to the White House. President Obama himself has several times, from what I hear, asked personally about how Power Africa is progressing. And we're taking it really seriously that not only President Obama, but also the countries are holding us accountable for not only the commitments that we've made, but for all the other assistance that we're really offering that is more of a capacity building kind. So I do think that not only are all the agencies committed, and actually it's one of the first efforts where all the agencies are aligned. I'm sure Kamran could speak more to this, and Michelle can. I mean, I just saw Michelle this morning at a meeting in Washington, D.C. on Power Africa. It's really, really remarkable. The last thing I wanted to say is that specifically in Tanzania, we're working with the Rural Energy Agency, and we are supporting the development of off-grid projects that are incredibly important. And the reason, and we actually started doing this prior to Power Africa under the Partnership for Growth Initiative. And the reason we did that is because for us, it was a natural progression from our work in agriculture. We do a lot of work in agriculture, especially in the SAGCOT corridor, which is the trade corridor in Tanzania. And what we noticed is that a lot of businesses that we were helping with, providing them with better seeds or providing them with better irrigation systems, actually were constrained by the fact that they did not have access to affordable, reliable energy. So if you have to start your equipment every couple of hours because of a blackout, this really doesn't bode well for your cost of goods and then for your ability to compete in the marketplace. So what we're really trying to do is develop solutions in parallel with the larger projects that are grid connected to really make sure that all the new technologies are being deployed and are being really developed in parallel with connecting more people to the main grid.
All right, let me try to help my colleagues now to answer some of the questions because there are so many tough questions here. First of all, I just want to start with the question about who's coordinating. Just going back, just to elaborate a little bit, more disclosure, I am a White House appointee, so you will see where my bias lies. But Power Africa is a presidential initiative, and typically what the U.S. government and many other governments do in similar situations is we end up with an Africa strategy. It takes months for all these agencies to grapple around and figure out what should be written, and every line is negotiated, and months and years later, then they start to think about how do we get the budget to implement it, and then who will implement it, and by the time you're done, you're on to the next topic. So this time, the president has actually announced an initiative which goes to the heart of an actual action at the end of that. So it's not just talk, it's very specific action, electrification of Africa, bringing power to Africa. And all these agencies have been tasked to deliver behind it. And it is coordinated, as Agnes said, by the White House. And this is, somebody had asked a question about private sector doesn't come, or they're very reluctant to come to Africa. This is a very important step because it allows, it literally forces all these U.S. government agencies to operate in Africa and get very, very active the way we are. which allows a lot of US firms to come around these government agencies and look for investment, and they feel a lot more comfortable because an OPEC or a USAID or a XM is involved, so they come in their shadows. So it's a very significantly different tactic and approach to getting actually something done in Africa as opposed to just talking about it. So I wanted to just start off with the appropriate amount of disclosure. Question about politics and tariff increases and so on. I want to take that because MCC is actually the one involved in Tanzania. We've been involved with TANESCO for a long time, and we have a very strong view that reforms are very, very critical. They must happen at the same time as we're trying to do transactions. So one of the things that did not come out, Power Africa is a very transactional initiative. So it is not just about policy, not just about capacity building, doing workshops, writing papers, and then going home 4 years later. It's about doing deals, doing transactions, and showing results. That's what is being demanded literally by the White House and from all the senior management. So we have to now balance these two ends, and this also goes to what have we learned from around the world, from Latin America, from Eastern Europe, Asia, South Asia, East Asia. You know, as somebody who's done project finance for a living for 2 decades now, I can tell you there's a balancing act. So a lot of these countries in Africa are also not very creditworthy yet. They are just barely making it up into that realm. So you don't want to put too much burden on them, too much guarantees, too much structured transactions, because then they will run into a fiscal problem. So we have to find the right realistic balance between creating reforms, you know, changing the tariffs, getting the environment where private sector would feel comfortable, doing deals because you wanted to show actual results, but not doing it so much and structuring deals so much that they start to become a problem on the balance sheets of these countries. And it's it's going to take some time, and it requires a lot of expectation management. Part of this discussion is for you to understand how much is doable and how much is not going to happen in the next 3 years, 5 years. It's a long-term journey. But some countries will manage to do it, where they will raise the tariffs, they will get the reforms done, and they will manage the politics, and others will not. And they'll have to wait X number of years before they come up into that area. And this is a process of development. This happens in our country. You know, how many laws are we able to actually digest? I don't need to mention any. So, you know, we all as societies go through that, and there's a time for certain things to happen, and there's a time when certain things, no matter how important they are and how much we want them to happen, don't happen when you thought they would happen. So this is development, and you know, these countries in Africa are no different from the countries that have gone through this process, the Koreas of the world, the Malaysias of the world, or Brazils or India, and they'll go through it. And there's no magic bullet. What we can do as U.S. government is make a very honest effort to try to push this envelope, and we are already doing, and we're already starting to see some results.
Can I just clarify one thing about Power Africa, because I think it came along. The $7 billion. So, right? Do you want to speak to that?
Well, why don't you go ahead?
I mean, Power Africa, the $7 billion is meant to catalyze the $40 billion or the $400 billion that is really needed. I don't think any governments or donors will be able to really pull together enough resources to be accessed by African governments to fund projects that are really needed to accomplish what we're trying to do. And it's not also, the other thing I want to clarify, it's not a competition between all the countries to access the $7 billion. That is really not how we're thinking of it. We're really thinking of it, how can we use the $7 billion very strategically to really bring in the kind of investment that's needed to address these challenges. I wanted to clarify that, because this is not a program where governments apply to get a part of the $7 billion and we give a check for $7 billion. That is really not what Power Africa is about.
Right. So I think there was a question about, if it's only 7 billion, why do this versus, where did he go? Still here, right? The ex-CEO. Look, I can tell you just from my personal experience, I spent 9 years working in China. And I think we'll all agree that if there's a country that has a checkbook, that would be China. And right now. And I can tell you all 9 years were spent advising Ministry of Finance of China and their planning ministry on how to bring private capital in infrastructure. So that's why I mentioned earlier, every country is focused on getting private capital. So this cannot be about $7 billion is going to change Africa through direct investment. It is about not only just leveraging other capital, but setting the right model, which can then be replicated. So what we are trying to do is to say, well, how can we have an EXIM and USAID and so on and so forth kind of structure to get 1 or 2 models in place in each country. And if those models work and the investors make money or don't lose money, then those models can be replicated. And it is not going to be easy. It is not going to work in every country. It's not going to work in the next 3 years in all 6 of these countries, perhaps. It'll work in 1, 2, 3. But the process is being started, and a lot of effort is being put, and there are countries on the other end who are doing what they need to do to become more and more attractive to investment. Remember, we already have established that FDI to Africa has been on a hockey stick, literally, what they call hockey. It's a very steep curve from 1990, I think, to at 1.5 billion to 2013 is what, 40 something, right? FDI. So that's a significant curve. So it's not that Africa can't attract capital. The point is, can you attract capital in infrastructure or in what is called public infrastructure? To do that, you have to make it attractive. You have to take the risk out. You have to set the right environment. And these U.S. government agencies can help. Will they always be successful in every project? Probably not. But in some projects they would. And if they do, and you can start